Elaine Carter had been married to Andrew for 23 years. Through thick and thin, sickness and health, she had stood by his side quietly, loyally, and without ever demanding much in return. But as she stood at the back of his funeral procession, her heels sinking slightly into the cold November grass, it became painfully clear how little her presence meant to his family. "You walk behind us, Judith," Andrew's mother hissed through clenched teeth, adjusting her pearl-encrusted hat. Her voice was sharp, rehearsed. "Know your place." Elaine didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply stood still, clutching the small envelope Andrew had placed in her hands just a week before he passed. "Don't open this unless they betray you," he had whispered, his fingers frail but his gaze unflinching. Even as his body weakened, Andrew had sensed what was coming. Behind Judith, Andrew's adult children, from his previous marriage, Brian, Jared, and Ashley, stood in a perfect line, dressed impeccably and radiating grief for show. Jared refused to meet her eyes. Ashley smirked behind her tissue. Brian kept staring at his shoes. And Elaine, the woman who had cared for Andrew in his final months, who had made his soup from scratch and held his hand through pain, was left in the shadows. As the cars began lining up, Elaine watched as distant relatives, family friends, and even casual acquaintances took spots ahead of her. People she had hosted in her home. People who didn't even know Andrew's favorite song, much less what time he liked his tea. Yet here they were front and center, while she stood behind, invisible. And still, her hand clutched the envelope. She could feel it pressing against her purse, as if it had its own pulse. Andrew's final gift. His insurance policy against the cruelty he knew too well. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she let the silence stretch. Let everyone feel the weight of what was being done to her. And let Judith think she had won. But Elaine wasn't broken. She was waiting. And the moment was getting closer. The ride to the cemetery was quiet, but not peaceful. Elaine sat stiffly in the backseat of the Hendersons' car, neighbors from down the street, who had offered her a place when they saw her standing alone. Mrs. Henderson had looped her arm through Elaine's as if to anchor her back to dignity. "You're family to us," she had whispered, loud enough for others to hear. The words clung to Elaine's chest like warmth in a blizzard. But the truth was, she had never really been family to the Carters. Not in their eyes. In 23 years of marriage, Elaine had been assigned 1,000 small roles that said outsider. She was always the one taking pictures, never in them. At Christmas dinners, she was told to sit in the kitchen to help with serving while the others toasted champagne in the formal dining room. In family portraits, she was nudged to the back row, often cropped out entirely in the final frame. They never said it outright, but the message was always clear. "You're not one of us." Even Brian, her husband, had failed her time and again. He never corrected his mother when Judith called Elaine the help. He never defended her when Jared mocked her modest upbringing or when Ashley laughed at her department store shoes. Elaine used to tell herself he was just caught in the middle. Now she wondered if maybe he liked her being silent, convenient, disposable. As the funeral procession rolled forward, Elaine sat up straighter. From this third car she could see them all, their polished hair, designer sunglasses, and carefully practiced frowns. She could also see something else, their blind spots. The spaces they thought were safe from consequence. From truth. She remembered what Andrew once told her during one of their quiet conversations. "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait. Patience isn't weakness, Elaine. It's preparation." And she had waited. Waited through the backhanded compliments, through being erased in her own home, through being told she should feel lucky to be included at all. Now, with Andrew gone and the envelope pressing against her hip like a living thing, Elaine wasn't feeling lucky. She was feeling ready. The Carter family home hadn't changed. The same polished mahogany walls, the same chandelier flickering soft gold over the foyer. But when Elaine stepped through the front door, something felt different, as if the very air had shifted. Andrew was gone, but his presence lingered like a quiet observer in every corner. "Everyone in the den," Judith announced the moment they entered. Her voice had shed the softness she wore at the gravesite. Here she was back to being the queen of the castle. Brian obediently followed. Jared trailed behind, and Ashley took her usual spot on the love seat, checking her reflection in her phone screen as she sat. Elaine stood to the side of the room, behind Andrew's beloved first edition bookshelf. It was the same place they always put her, out of view, out of mind. "Nicole," Ashley said, her tone syrupy with false concern, "you don't mind standing, do you? It's just there aren't enough seats for everyone close to Dad." Close to Dad. Elaine felt her grip tighten on her purse, but she didn't respond. She let them think what they wanted. Then the lawyer arrived. Mr. Grayson had been the family attorney for over a decade. He looked nervous, his eyes darting toward Elaine before quickly looking away. He shuffled papers, cleared his throat, and began. "This is the last will and testament of Andrew Carter." The room held its breath as he read. "Jared received 40% of Carter Enterprises and the commercial properties downtown. Ashley got the beach house on Hilton Head, where Elaine had planted every flower in the garden with her own hands. Brian received the investment portfolio and the family home." Elaine was not mentioned. "That concludes the reading," Mr. Grayson said, snapping the folder shut like a coffin lid. The reaction was instant. Ashley clapped her hands together. "Finally, I can redo the kitchen the way I've always wanted." Jared had already pulled out his phone, likely estimating rental income on the beach property. Brian sat stunned, but not speechless. A small, almost smug smile tugged at the edge of his mouth. Judith turned to Elaine with a pitying expression. "I'm sure you understand, dear. Andrew wanted everything to stay in the bloodline. If you need more time in the guest house, we'll allow it." Elaine looked at her, the words washing over her like acid. The guest house, once a garage, was barely livable, and after 2 decades of loyalty, that was what they were offering her. "A place out back." "No," she said quietly, and reached into her purse. Everyone turned as she pulled out the envelope, the one Andrew had given her, the one sealed with weight far heavier than paper. Mr. Grayson looked alarmed. "I believe you need to read this," Elaine said, handing him the document. "It's the real will, the one Andrew signed 3 weeks ago." The air in the room shifted. Judith's face paled. Jared dropped his phone. Ashley's hand froze mid-scroll. And Brian finally looked up at his wife, not with confidence, but with fear. Mr. Grayson's fingers trembled as he opened the envelope. The seal cracked with a quiet finality, like the snap of an old branch. Inside was a legal document signed, notarized, and dated 3 weeks earlier than the one he had just read aloud. "This appears to be a newer will," he muttered, color draining from his face. Elaine nodded once. The actual will. Andrew's real final wish. The room turned cold. Grayson cleared his throat, struggling to regain composure. "According to this will, Andrew Carter leaves his entire estate to his wife, Elaine Carter." He paused, then read the note attached in Andrew's handwriting. "If this document is not read first, my family has committed fraud. Hold them accountable." Ashley gasped. Jared stood frozen. Brian's face went blank. But Judith didn't flinch. No panic, no confusion, only a slow narrowing of the eyes. She knew. "That's fake," she said, but her voice lacked its usual command. Andrew wasn't well. He was confused. Anyone could have tricked him. Elaine didn't reply. Instead, she reached once more into her purse. This time, she pulled out a small flash drive. She held it up between 2 fingers and looked at Mr. Grayson. Andrew anticipated this. He left something else for this moment. Grayson hesitated. "Perhaps we should schedule a follow-up meeting." "No," Elaine interrupted gently. Andrew was clear. If his original will was ignored, this video should be played immediately. The lawyer slowly plugged the drive into his laptop. The screen glowed blue in the dimly lit den. Then Andrew appeared. Not the frail man they'd buried that morning, but the version of him from months earlier, sharp-eyed, composed, and unshakably clear. "If you're watching this," Andrew said in the video, "then my family has already tried to cut Elaine out, and they've likely done more than just lie." Silence gripped the room like a vice. Then the footage shifted. A timestamp appeared in the corner, 2 weeks before Andrew's death. The grainy video now showed this very room. Judith's voice, cold and calculated. "The doctor says his balance is bad. 1 fall down the stairs." "Mom, stop," Jared whispered in the recording. "He doesn't even use the handrail anymore." "Those meds make him dizzy," Judith replied. "Accidents happen all the time." Mr. Grayson's voice entered next, nervous but present. "If the new will is too recent, it might be questioned." "Then we make sure no one asks questions," Jared answered. Ashley chimed in from off camera. He's giving everything to her. She's turned him against us. Present day Ashley made a choking sound. Jared's hands clenched the armrests. Brian looked like he might vomit. And Elaine? Elaine stood in the middle of the room, steady as stone. You thought I wouldn't know, she said, her voice quiet but deadly. But Andrew recorded everything. No one spoke. Because there was nothing left to deny. The silence after the video ended was the kind that felt physical, like a vacuum pulling the air straight out of the room. The only sound was the ticking of the antique clock on the wall, each tick like a hammer on cold metal. Elaine let it linger. Let them sit in it. Judith had sunk into her chair, her pearls askew, her expression unreadable. Ashley was crying now, not soft tears, but ugly sobs of a collapsing performance. Jared stared at the screen as if hoping it would rewind and undo everything. And Brian, he looked lost, as if the house he had grown up in had become a stranger overnight. Elaine stepped forward and placed a thick manila folder on the coffee table. If you're wondering what comes next, she said softly, you might want to take a look at this. Mr. Grayson reached for it with hesitant hands, his professional mask now cracked beyond repair. Inside were years' worth of documents. Bank transfers. Property deeds. Signed, notarized, filed dating back over 5 years. Elaine kept her voice steady, almost conversational. Andrew didn't just rewrite his will. He began transferring everything to me years ago. Ashley's breath caught. The beach house, Jared asked, already knowing the answer. Transferred 2 summers ago, Elaine replied. The same weekend you called me just the second wife in front of your friends. Judith leaned forward. This isn't possible. We would have known there would have been paperwork. There was, Elaine cut in. You just never asked. You assumed he still belonged to you. That I'd always be just the woman who served you coffee and kept quiet. Brian finally spoke. You isolated him. You turned him against his family. Elaine tilted her head. Did I? Or did you all do that yourselves? She walked over to Andrew's desk and pulled out another document, a printed spreadsheet, with notes in Andrew's handwriting beside each item. Every time one of you humiliated me, Andrew made a decision. A quiet transfer. A shift in ownership. Like clockwork. She handed the list to Brian. January 15th, 2020, she read aloud. The day you started your affair with Rebecca? That afternoon, Andrew signed over 15% of the company to me. Brian's mouth opened, but no words came. March 3rd, 2021, she continued. Judith told Andrew I was a gold digger who didn't belong at the charity gala. The next morning, he moved the investment portfolio into my name. Elaine paused, then smiled faintly. You thought today was about inheriting what was his. She turned slowly, meeting each of their eyes. But you can't steal what no longer exists. They tried to erase me, she said quietly. But Andrew made sure I'd never be the one left empty-handed. The room was spinning now, not from confusion but from clarity. Cold, bitter, undeniable truth. And for the first time in years, Elaine felt something unfamiliar blooming in her chest. Control. Elaine took a slow, steady breath. Then reached into her purse one final time. What she pulled out wasn't dramatic in size, just 3 small, sealed envelopes. But their weight was undeniable. I made a phone call this morning, she said calmly, while you were getting dressed for what you thought would be your celebration. Judith sat forward. To who? Elaine looked at her, her voice sharp with precision. To Detective Monahan. Fraud Division. No relation, but she's thorough. The doorbell rang at that exact moment, a piercing chime that cut through the thick silence like a blade. Everyone froze. Mark, who had been silent until now, shot to his feet, panic etched into every line of his face. I'm not going to prison for this, he snapped, voice rising. This wasn't my idea. Sit down, Judith barked, her tone still full of command, though her power was fading fast. And keep your mouth shut. Elaine didn't flinch. She turned and walked toward the door. When she opened it, 2 detectives stepped in, professional, focused, and already informed. Mrs. Carter, Detective Monahan asked. Elaine nodded. That's me. Thank you for coming so quickly. She led them into the den, where 4 people now looked less like heirs and more like defendants. The detective scanned the room with practiced eyes, then looked at Elaine. You mentioned you had evidence of fraud and conspiracy. I do, she replied, placing the 3 envelopes on the coffee table. The video you just saw is part of it, she added, gesturing to the still glowing laptop screen. But I have more. She slid the first envelope across to Judith. Inside was a cheap rhinestone necklace with a sticky note. Didn't suit you anyway. Elaine explained. Thanksgiving, 3 years ago. She took it from my jewelry box and wore it out of the house. Judith turned red, but said nothing. Petty theft is still theft, Detective Monahan noted, jotting it down. The second envelope was for Jared. He hesitated, then opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a debt forgiveness letter with a bold red stamp across the top, void. Elaine spoke softly but clearly. You owe me $214,000 in unpaid loans. Now that I'm Andrew's legal heir, you owe me that directly. 30 days to pay in full. Jared's face drained of color. The final envelope was for Ashley. This time, Elaine opened it herself, pulling out printed emails, romantic messages between Ashley and Mr. Grayson, the family's lawyer. Harold Grayson gasped. This is outrageous. Elaine cut him off. Security cameras. Andrew had them installed 2 years ago, including in your so-called private office. Detective Monahan straightened up. Mr. Grayson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, Harold's composure disintegrated. I was following instructions, he cried, turning toward Judith. Tell them it was your idea. But Judith stayed silent. As the door closed behind the disgraced attorney, Elaine stood calmly in the center of the room, the storm now swirling around everyone but her. Justice had arrived. And it was just getting started. The room didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a courtroom, except no one needed a judge. The evidence had already spoken. The faces that once wore smug certainty now looked hollow, stripped of power. That's when Brian stood up, his hands out in front of him like a man trying to stop an avalanche with bare palms. Elaine, he said, voice cracking, we can fix this. Please, we've been through so much. We're still family. Elaine didn't blink. You're only calling me family now, she said slowly, because I'm the only one left with anything to offer. He opened his mouth to respond, but she was already reaching into her purse again. This time she pulled out a thick envelope stamped with the letterhead of a prominent law firm. She laid it gently on the table in front of him. You'll want to sign that, she said. Divorce papers. Filed last week. Brian's shoulders crumpled. You were planning this? Elaine nodded. While you were planning how to split the inheritance, I was planning my freedom. She turned away from him and walked to the head of the dining table. The very seat where Andrew had presided for decades. The one Judith had always walked behind, but never dared to sit in. Elaine pulled out the chair and lowered herself into it, slow and steady. Not to prove a point, but to take the place that had always been waiting. Judith's voice was barely a whisper. What are you doing? Elaine met her eyes across the table. Taking my seat. The symbolism hung in the air like incense. This wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about restoration. About rewriting the story in her own voice. She glanced at the family portraits on the wall, the ones where she had always been cropped out, pushed to the side. From this angle, they looked different. Smaller. Like ghosts from a past she no longer had to appease. Detective Monahan gathered the last of the documents, then turned to Elaine. We'll need a formal statement from you tomorrow. Elaine nodded. I'll bring everything. Andrew kept records. I kept the truth. And as the officers stepped outside, Elaine remained in the chair. Andrew's chair. Now hers. And this time no one dared to ask her to move. The house grew quiet again, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of grief or guilt, it was the calm that comes after a storm has passed, leaving only truth in its wake. Elaine sat alone at the head of the table, her hands resting gently on the polished surface Andrew had once guarded like a throne. Her eyes moved slowly around the room. Judith sat rigid, her spine straight but her power broken. Jared stared at the floor, silently calculating debts he could never repay. Ashley dabbed at her mascara-streaked cheeks, no longer concerned with appearances. Brian remained motionless, the divorce papers still unopened in front of him. Elaine took a deep breath. I was never behind you, she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. I was just waiting for the right moment to pass you all. She let the words linger. Andrew had taught her many things: how to love with steadiness, how to listen more than speak, but perhaps his greatest gift was this: the understanding that patience, when paired with clarity, becomes power. She looked up at the portraits one last time. This time she didn't see judgment or exclusion. She saw herself reflected not in the frames but in the legacy that now truly belonged to her. The house. The business. The name. All protected. All restored. As the last light of day filtered through the windows, casting long, amber shadows across the floor, Elaine didn't smile. She didn't need to. She had already won. And the people who once made her walk behind them, they would never be part of her story again. If Elaine's story moved you, if you've ever felt invisible, erased, or dismissed, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to know that quiet strength isn't weakness. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of truth, justice, and emotional triumph.